It's my feel-good breakfast show.
It is your Feel Good Breakfast Show. And today we want you to celebrate your mother language. International Mother Language Day, it is so key. It was a day declared by the General Conference of the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. In case you didn't know, that was the expanded version. In November 1999, it's a day that highlights the role that languages play in fostering inclusion and achieving sustainable development goals across the world. And we have senior lecturer in linguistics at UCT, Dr. Michelle Thompson, to educate us. Dr. Wamkelekile, ¿cómo está?
Thank you. I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. I just thought we're going to change up. We're going to drop in some random words just to make sure we are nourishing the international mother language, which is fantastic. Right,
God,
let's go and talk about 40% of the global population, because I do my research before these things, right? They lack access to education in their native language. That's a huge gap, because you want people to learn in their mother tongue. You want them to feel included. But more importantly, the education has got to be secure. There can't be the anxiety of learning outside of your language barriers. And this is why I want to ask you about how important is it for us to encourage, foster and advocate for us to be taught in our mother language?
It's absolutely imperative. I mean, I always say to my students, imagine learning in a language that you are still within the process of learning.
Yes.
Whereas learning in a language that you're familiar with, that is part of who you are, that's part of your identity, it's the language that you grew up with, it's the language that you think in, automatically there's better chances of academic progress.
Absolutely.
So we're thinking about developing critical literacy skills for people who speak their native language, and it's absolutely imperative.
It is indeed, because it also does foster an environment where culture can be preserved within those languages, and more of the curriculums can include a bit more around mother tongue, but also the way people articulate within their specific culture. And I think that's so important as well. Is that also something that you feel is a massive lack in terms of cultural preservation through language?
Most definitely. It's not just cultural preservation, but you always think about group identity, group belonging. Who you are is intrinsically tied to your language. If you think about the language that you speak, there's some kind of meaning that is attached to that. It's linked to history. It's sometimes linked to worship. Sometimes the language you speak directly relates to the divine. So cultural preservation, 100%, because culture is tied to language. We experience our culture through language. And like I said, a lot of our histories, a lot of our heritage is tied to language.
Another stat that I researched, around 45% of the estimated 7,000 languages spoken around the world are currently endangered. Why is that? And how can we start looking after these languages better?
I think perhaps I should start with saying what an endangered language is.
Yes, I think that's a very good idea. Let's talk about that first.
So when we talk about endangered languages in linguistics, we talk about languages that are at risk of being phased out. And this usually happens when people are no longer speaking that language. First of all, when there's a very small group of people who are still speaking it, but also when there isn't intergenerational transmission. So the older people who do speak the language are no longer teaching the younger generation to speak it. So it kind of is at risk of dying out with its current speakers, and that could be a very small number. In terms of an example, I think you asked?
Yes, an example of an endangered language, that would be great to hear. and also why it became endangered. I think that's important. So which one, like a little anecdotal idea?
An anecdotal idea for an example, and then maybe how it happened.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So one of the languages that I can think of, and it's something that we're quite focused on in our Department of African Studies and Linguistics, is Ngqu. This is a San language that is spoken in the Northern Cape, and currently there's only one speaker, one living speaker of the language, Honorary Dr. Katrina Isso.
Wow.
But this brings me back to how does a language die out and how can we prevent it? Social positioning. It's the value that people assign to language. If you feel that the language that you grew up with, your mother tongue, your native language, is not important and there's no social mobility or upward mobility in that language, then you might shift to a different one, and it's often the colonial languages. So we try to foster this mother tongue education and this cultural preservation so that people can get a sense that actually their languages matter and there is mobility and there are opportunities within their language. So most important, it is actually the attitudes that speakers have of these languages.
That's brilliant, and that language example it's quite powerful, because if we lose that professor, that person, we lose an entire language. We lose somebody's heritage in a way, and how to articulate it. And you can transcribe so much, but there are certain words and languages that have even more descriptive and powerful meaning in terms of cultural relevance, which is so important. Just one thing in terms of linguistics, I need to ask this on Mother Language Day. How important is colloquial or slang in the bridges? I need to ask, because I know if you're a purist, I understand, but do you think that's actually also quite important in terms of adding a bit of glue to social interaction and, of course, language development and pushing it forward?
First of all, I'm not a purist.
Yes! Now let's talk. Aware.
Yeah, aware. I am a linguistic descriptivist, which means that I like to look at what's happening with language, how people are using it and what it means to them, as opposed to making prescriptions for what language should look like. I think colloquialisms, like you say, are the glue, but also it's the spice of language. And it's how we communicate, it's how we connect, it's how we kind of foster that in-group identity, that ethno-linguistic belonging.
Yes.
And I think that, Mebru, if we don't use colloquial languages, I mean, we have to bet, right? So I think it's absolutely vital. I think it shows the linguistic creativity of speakers. So I'm absolutely all for it.
This is fantastic. Thank you, Doctor. I needed to make sure that was quite apparent, because as you said, ethno-linguistic, that connection that you have, it means that there's a sense of belonging when you use certain colloquialisms and slang, which I love. So, wow, Doctor, thank you, and happy International Mother Language Day. Maybe preserve these beautiful languages, because they preserve culture and history, so we need to look after them as much as we can. And I encourage you, learn a new language today, learn a greeting, learn something, but more importantly, continue lumming at 8 with your Feel Good Breakfast Show.